Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture on collective trauma, transitional justice, and reconciliation. Why are dealing with the past and transitional justice relevant for our field? They are important for the peace processes and reconciliation because how we deal with the past will affect possibility of future conflict and its prevention. um, every society needs to deal with the past in order to move forward, reestablish relationships and order. And memories of different parties to the conflict are different and often they're in conflict. So the question is how we, as resolution practitioners and scholars, can help the parties in finding common ground. So, if we look at our conflict curve, we can see that it is the last stage of the curve that is called post-conflict peace building stage. And in this stage, we have these processes of post-conflict reconstruction, reconciliation, and transitional justice. Uh, what so these approaches of dealing with the past, and here we are talking about the past conflict, past atrocities, past events that happen. How are societies dealing with this difficult past? What are the approaches? So state usually has control over memorialization processes through different top-down approaches from judiciary, truth and reconciliation commissions, memorials, history textbooks, and so on. So much of these approaches are top-down, state-led approaches. Decision of what is taught to the new generations about conflict, about the past, is based on political agendas and national building ideology. However, dealing with the past and reconciliation processes cannot happen without the citizens who appropriate these historical narratives, these memories. So there is this interesting interaction between um, top-down state approaches and how the grassroots, how the people are actually interacting and absorbing them. So here we have a model that explains different approaches to dealing with this difficult past. And this model is developed by the Swiss Peace and Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs. And it's a very good visualization of the approaches. As you can see, um, we have these four big quadrants, and this is where we can place these main approaches of dealing with the past. So, right to know, so like let's say truth and reconciliation commissions, truth commissions, um, investigation panels, archives, history books, and so on. So, why right to know? Because we need to know what happened. We need to know the truth of what happened in conflict. It's really important to establish facts and objective truth. Although this can be very difficult because different parties have different interpretations of the truth. And then the second quadrant is right to reparation. This is rehabilitation processes, compensation for the victims, apologies, um, and commemorations, and so on. Also, very important to address these um, wrongs that were done to the victims and somehow compensate them for their suffering. Then we have in the lower left quadrant right to justice, which is very important. And this is where we have these retributive processes such as international tribunals, courts, trials, witness protection programs, and so on. So you could have seen in the in for example, why International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia (ICTY) that was established after the conflict in the Balkans, and where the major perpetrators, the leadership, was brought to trial. So that's one example of this right to justice. And then we have guarantee of non-recurrence of violence. So how do we make sure in the aftermath of conflict or violence um, to establish a more sustainable peace, and so that the violence does not escalate and occur again. So processes of disarmament, reintegration of former combatants are important. There has to be institutional reforms, um, different approaches of government, of security sector, police. There has to be illustration and vetting. So finding out what were the past wrongs and how were they addressed and so on. And as you can see, at the center of this model are victims and perpetrators, because these approaches are all focusing on addressing victims' call for justice and reparation, and addressing the wrongs that were done, but also they are focusing on perpetrators, on punishing basically the perpetrators. So two upper quadrants, right to know and right to reparation, are focusing more on the victims, and right to justice and guarantee of non-recurrence are approaches that are focused more on perpetrators. As you can see, you have two arrows going outwards towards the outward circles of this model, and you have conflict transformation that is supposed to happen through these different approaches. And then the final circle is reconciliation. Reconciliation is the final outcome that that should happen if all of these processes are done properly. And reconciliation is the most difficult one, because reconciliation is about rebuilding trust in communities and rebuilding relationships that were broken during the conflict. So what's important to say is that different approaches are applied in different contexts. So for example, you will not have, let's say, a right to know approaches in every context. It worked for example, in South Africa with the famous Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so right to know approaches. But it didn't work in the Balkans. So in the Balkans, there was more focus on the right to justice, which are the approaches that were focusing on perpetrators and more on the retributive justice, on punishing the perpetrators. So in Rwanda, you have both. You have Gacaca courts and national courts, but also international tribunal for the leadership um, of the regime that implemented the genocide. So, but you also have these local courts called Gacaca courts, which also had some kind of a restorative component in it. So they were important as a truth telling, and also in a way communal punishment of perpetrators of the crimes. So each society chooses its own approach to dealing with the past according to their own according to their own context, culture, tradition, and so on. Okay, so collective memory and national identity. What why is this important? Because state has a partial control over memorialization processes through different top-down approaches from judiciary, TRCs, memorials, history textbooks. But appropriation or reception of memory cannot be fully controlled uh, because people on the ground, individuals, remember differently the past. There are different interpretations of past. So what we can see is that memory is fluid because it is shaped through the interaction between top-down elite-generated memory and individual memories of the people on the grassroots level. And how memory impacts conflict. So memory, we're talking about memory in the aftermath of conflict. Memory of the past does impact the present because these different historical narratives may ignite violence and create social polarization. So these past stories about the past, about what happened in conflict, these historical narratives, they also contain within collective traumas that continue to haunt and divide societies. So, what is collective trauma? Collective trauma occurs when an event leaves some indelible marks on the consciousness of a collective, shaping their memory and identity. By constructing collective trauma, societies identify the source of suffering, assume moral responsibility, and solidarity with the members of the in-group. So there is a sense of shared suffering. So it's very important to pay attention to the collective trauma. So you have in the readings Volkan, Volkan, who is a scholar who is particularly interested in trauma. He calls it chosen trauma, and he comes from a psychoanalytic tradition. So what are these chosen traumas? These are shared mental representations of a traumatic past event during which the group suffered loss and experienced shame and humiliation in a conflict with another group. So, important elements of chosen trauma are victimhood and martyrdom. So, trauma, what's also important to remember is that trauma is not located in a simple violent event in the of the past, but rather in the way its very unassimilated nature returns to haunt the survivor later on. So um, these chosen traumas, collective traumas, are very much alive and they have a life of their own almost, and they can be triggered very easily. So collective trauma comes back to haunt us because it is unstimulated. It's never fully accepted because we as human beings have a difficult time to accept and recognize these horrible events that happen to our ancestors and to us and so on. So um, because there's so much suffering and sometimes trying to forget is a way to cope with trauma, but not in the case of collective trauma because it comes back to haunt societies again. Transgenerational transmission of trauma. This is another important concept that Volkan discussed in his theory of chosen trauma. He says that this shared traumatic event is linked to the past generation's inability to mourn losses of people, land, or prestige. And it indicates the group's failure to reverse narcissistic injury and humiliation inflicted by another large group. So, injured self images associated with a traumatic event are then transmitted to children in the next generation, as if these children will be able to mourn the loss or reverse the humiliation. So, what he's basically saying that because the generation that has lived through a certain terrible collective trauma, some atrocity or genocide or some kind of a terrible thing that happens in conflict, they are not they cannot assimilate it, they cannot accept it and recognize it fully. So and because of that there is no healing, but they are transmitting the stories of this trauma on their children, and that they're also transmitting emotional, physical, and social pain that they live through to their descendants. So, um, in a way, that's also a way to cope with that trauma, because at least these terrible ordeals will not be forgotten by the future generation, and if they are not forgotten, then also um, they will not be repeated. Right? So that's the logic behind it. Okay, so what is we'll look at a little bit the constructivist view of collective trauma. Well, so as we said before, memory um, is a bit different than history, because history, uh, although some people are saying, oh well, it's written by the victors, but memory is more subjective, because memory is not necessarily based on facts. There has to be an element of truth in memory, but individuals, just remember things differently. So constructivism explains how this collective trauma um, narrative, how the construction of collective trauma works. Well, according to this theory, trauma is socially constructed through narratives, symbols, art, history textbooks, memorials, and so on. And it is through imaginative process of representation that we can re-experience trauma. So these representations of traumatic events become crucial for reinventing, like a national solidarity and bonds within in-groups, and healing the social fabric. Okay. So because these representations, this how we represent trauma, that really matters. The way we represent the trauma can impact the response to it. It can determine our behavior, it can determine our perceptions, uh, and this representation therefore is very important, and it can be an entry point for intervention. So the main question is, can collective traumas be represented in such a way that they properly acknowledge the victims and the horrific crimes, but at the same time provide space for peace building, reconciliation, and healing? So let's look at the one example of collective trauma of Guernica. This is what is Guernica? Where is Guernica? This is um, a famous from the Second World War, but the collective trauma of Guernica bombing is still very much alive in our collective consciousness because of its representation through art, and in particular Picasso's painting Guernica, the famous painting Guernica, which became a symbol of suffering, especially civilian suffering in the war. Because Guernica is a town in Spain. It is actually part of this autonomous region, Basque Country, of Spain. It's a small town of 16 people, But it's famous because the first aerial bombing by Nazi Germany, Luftwaffe, in 1937, which is a little bit before the Second World War, but during the Spanish Civil War, it was done, this bombing, and because Franco, the leader of the um, Spanish radical right, was invited Germany to bomb that town because they saw that town as the center of resistance towards fascism and Nazism and so on. So this bombing of the civilians in this town inspired the painting Guernica by Pablo Picasso, and became a big protest. The representation of Guernica as this famous painting became a symbol of anti-war protest. So Guernica is very important because it's not just a symbol of resistance, of this Republican resistance toward Franco's fascism, but it was a seat of the parliament, and it was a meeting place of the assembly under this famous tree called Guernica coarbola. You see it here in this picture, um, and it became a symbol of the traditional rights and independence of the Basque people. And the Basque people uh, were part of the resistance in, those that are fighting fascists, Francoists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So basically, Guernica was the center of the Basque culture and identity. And on April 26th in 1937, these warplanes of German Condor Legion bombed Guernica for about 2 hours, and it was a market day at that time, so there were a lot of casualties, and particularly, children, women, old people, and so on. So the number of civilian casualties ranges between 300 and 1,700 people. It's, the numbers are still debated, but that's the range. Uh, um, so this is what made this crime so terrible, because that was the first time that the bombing was directed straight to civilians, to hurt civilians. So in the First World War, you had like trenches. In previous wars, you had armies that meet on some field and then they have a battle, right? In the First World War, there were trenches, there were these battles again, between soldiers on different sides. But now, for the first time, you have civilians as the main target. And that, was a big thing, and it changed the way the war is led, unfortunately. So um, there are again different interpretations of what happened. There is always like um, how to say difference in how many numbers. Some people are saying there is more of the casualties, some people are saying there is less, and so on. So memory of the past is a result of a process through which certain events and interpretations are remembered and prioritized, while others are relegated to secondary importance or forgotten. So we have to be aware that memory is selective, and there is this cyclical nature of historical narratives, which is the first step to reconciliation. Second step is to create a political and cultural space in which diverging narratives of the past can coexist despite the differences that divide them. So um, we have to realize that memory is selective, and the interpretations of events will be different. So we need to accept the existence of these different versions of the past. And but how do we bring people with different versions together? How can they find some common ground? Well, through creative and artistic initiatives. That is one way. So, can we use the fact that collective memory is located in cultural artifacts as a way to create a better narrative of the past? So, for example, what this representation of Guernica bombing through art? What does that mean? And how can art play a critical role in inspiring, educating, and responding to war? So let me show you then the famous painting, Picasso's Guernica. And mind you, this painting is huge. It's like size of a huge wall, but and it's in the tradition of Cubism. But and Cubism is especially expressive here because it shows this mutilation and anarchy and disorder that happens because of war, the destruction of war. So you can see this, and this painting, Picasso didn't want it to be in Spain, and it was for a long time actually in MoMA, in the Museum of um, Modern Art in New York. Um, but then it was until I think 1981 it was there. Because Franco stayed in power. Mind you, a fascist leader stayed in power in Spain until 1975. And Picasso didn't want his painting to go to Spain while Franco is in power. So, but nowadays it resides in this National Museum of Queen Sofia in Madrid. So you can see it there, and it's beautiful. And also, a tapestry copy of Picasso Guernica is on the wall of the United Nations building in New York City at the entrance of the Security Council room. So, also, if you go to the UN headquarters in New York, you'll be able to see it. So, symbolism. Um, well, some people said that the bull, the horse represents the civilian suffering because in Spanish bullfights, horse is usually a victim and victimized. On bull represents aggression, so the fascism, Nazism, and so on. There are also other meanings in this painting, and then I will leave it to you to look at it more closely to see, you know, what kind of meanings you can see from this representation of suffering in war, bombing, so on. And again, we have this opposite narratives of what this picture represents. So one side says who are pro Guernica, uh, that Guernica has always been bigger than art, uncontainable by the museum, one of those rare works that gets into the bloodstream of the common culture. Indeed, it became very much part of our human culture, right? Of humanity. It's such a powerful statement. And then there is another view that Guernica is a dream of a madman, a hodgepodge of parts of bodies that a 4-year-old child could have painted. So this is the German guidebook, how they describe Guernica at the Paris exhibition, where Guernica was first shown, exhibited, and it was actually placed across from the Spanish pavilion where the Spanish works were presented, exhibited. Spanish art was just across German pavilions, so the Germans could look at Guernica every day during that exhibition. So this was, there is a lot of symbolism, but the power of art is undeniable. So, the bombing of Guernica changed the way people view the war and the conflict parties. It was the first time that innocent civilians were the sole target, and this painting, this representation of this bombing, became a universal image that diverse groups of people suffering conflict can identify with. So, Picasso helped us to understand and respond to trauma on a deeper emotional level. The ability of art to incorporate multiple messages, feelings, and meanings is what makes this painting a universal symbol of protest against war that speaks through decades and is adopted in different contexts. So, um, why, what is this all? What is the conclusion to all this? That uh, how how is this relevant for conflict resolution? Well, we have to accept that there will always be differences in how the past is represented and understood. And mind you, this process of recognizing what happened in the past and accepting and addressing these atrocities that happened is a very difficult process, but it is very necessary for reconciliation. So, what I'm suggesting is that representing how we represent these events really matters. Rather than seeing them as an inevitable source of conflict, these representations, uh, difference, differences in historical understanding should be recognized as a part of an ongoing peace process. So we need to really think and be inventive and creative. Think how to represent historical traumas to bring people together, in this post conflict period, post peace building period. How to bring people together and not apart. How to promote reconciliation rather than division. Okay, so that's it for today. This is our final lecture. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to reading your blogs. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week.